From a general who told Washington everything was going perfectly in Vietnam, while his own officers watched the war fall apart around them, to the commander whose obsession with body counts turned an entire region of South Vietnam into a killing field where thousands of the dead may not have been enemy soldiers at all, to the man who designed a strategy to win the Vietnam War by killing more people than the enemy could replace, and never understood why it didn't work. These are the 5 worst generals of the Vietnam War, and every one of them had the power to change what happened. Number 5. Paul Harkins. Paul Harkins was the first commander of the United States Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. He held the post from 1962 to 1964, the years when America's involvement in Vietnam was still small enough to be shaped by a single commander's judgment, and Harkins's judgment was catastrophically wrong. From the moment he took command, Harkins told Washington exactly what Washington wanted to hear. The South Vietnamese army was improving, the Viet Cong were being pushed back. The strategic Hamlet program was working. Progress was being made on every front. None of it was true. His own field advisors knew it. American officers embedded with South Vietnamese units sent reports back describing an army riddled with poor leadership, political appointments, and a refusal to engage the enemy in any meaningful way. Those reports were filtered, softened, or ignored before they reached Washington. The clearest evidence came at the Battle of A Peak in January 1963. A well-armed South Vietnamese force of over 2,000 supported by American helicopters, armored personnel carriers, and artillery was defeated by roughly 350 Viet Cong fighters who stood and fought from prepared positions. The South Vietnamese refused to advance. Officers refused to lead. The operation collapsed into chaos. Harkins called APOC a victory. American reporters on the ground, including David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan, publicly contradicted him. The gap between what Harkins reported and what was actually happening in Vietnam became impossible to ignore. By 1964, Harkins was replaced by William Westmoreland, but the damage was done. The framework of optimistic reporting, of telling Washington what it wanted to hear instead of what it needed to know, was already built into the system, and it would poison American decision-making for the next decade. Harkins didn't lose the Vietnam War, but he built the foundation of lies on which every failed strategy that followed was constructed. The next general on this list inherited Harkins's war and failed not by lying about what was happening, but by failing to act when the truth was staring him in the face. Number 4. Samuel Coster. On March 16, 1968, soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, entered the village of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province. Over the next 4 hours, American soldiers killed between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, men, women, children, and infants. Many were sexually assaulted. The bodies were found in ditches. Major General Samuel Coster was the commanding general of the Americal Division, the division responsible for the units that carried out the massacre. Reports of what happened at My Lai reached Coster's headquarters. He was briefed, he was informed, and he did nothing. No investigation was ordered. No officers were questioned. No report was filed with higher command. The incident was buried in paperwork and silence. For over a year, the massacre remained hidden not because no one knew, but because the people who knew chose not to act. It was only when a soldier named Ron Ridenour wrote letters to Congress and the Pentagon in 1969 that the truth finally reached the public. The Army launched an investigation led by Lieutenant General William Peers. The Peers Commission found that at least 30 officers were involved in the cover-up, including Coster. Coster was charged with dereliction of duty and failure to obey lawful regulations. The criminal charges were eventually dropped, but he was stripped of his Distinguished Service Medal, demoted from Major General to Brigadier General, and issued a formal letter of censure. He had been serving as the superintendent of West Point, the institution that trains America's future officers. When the scandal broke, he resigned from that post. Coster didn't pull a trigger at My Lai, but he had the authority and the responsibility to ensure that what happened there was investigated, reported, and answered, for he chose silence, and that silence protected the killers for over a year. The next general on this list wasn't American. He was South Vietnamese, and his failures cost his country its northern provinces and ultimately its existence. Number 3. Hoang Xuan Lam. Lieutenant General Hoang Xuan Lam commanded I Corps, the northernmost military region of South Vietnam, during 2 of the most critical operations of the entire war. The first was Operation Lam Son 719 in February 1971. The objective was ambitious: South Vietnamese forces, without American ground troops but with American air support, would cross into Laos and cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply line that kept the North Vietnamese war effort alive. Lam was in command, and the operation became a disaster. North Vietnamese forces counterattacked with armor, artillery, and infantry in numbers that Lam had not anticipated. South Vietnamese units were surrounded. Overrun and routed, the retreat turned into a rout. The world watched as ARVN soldiers clung to the skids of American helicopters, desperate to escape. South Vietnam claimed it was a success. No one believed it. Lam Son 719 shattered confidence in Vietnamization, the American strategy of turning the war over to South Vietnamese forces. If the ARVN couldn't cut a supply route in Laos with full American air support, how could it defend South Vietnam alone? Lam's second failure was worse. In 1975, when North Vietnamese forces launched their final offensive, the northern provinces under Lam's responsibility collapsed in days. The retreat from the Central Highlands became one of the most chaotic military withdrawals in modern history. Hundreds of thousands of civilians and soldiers fled south in a column of terror. Thousands died on the road. Lam was widely regarded even among his own colleagues as a political appointee whose career was built on loyalty to President Thieu rather than military competence. He was included in what Vietnamese called the four great corruptions of the South Vietnamese regime. His incompetence cost South Vietnam its northern half, and without the north, there was no South Vietnam. Lam's failures were military incompetence on a national scale, but the next general on this list did something that goes beyond incompetence. He turned the body count into a weapon, and the people who died for it may not have been the enemy at all. Number 2, Julian Huel. Lieutenant General Julian Huel commanded the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta from 1968 to 1969. His soldiers knew him by a name that tells you everything you need to know. They called him the Butcher of the Delta. Huel was obsessed with one metric above all others: the body count. He believed that the war in Vietnam could be won by killing the enemy faster than they could be replaced, and he drove his subordinates to produce numbers with a relentless, unforgiving pressure that bordered on mania. Under Huel's command, the 9th Infantry Division launched Operation Speedy Express across the Mekong Delta. Over 6 months, the division reported killing 10,899 enemy fighters, but they recovered only 748 weapons. That ratio, nearly 15 dead for every weapon found, was unlike anything else in the entire war, a ratio that extreme could only mean one of two things. Either the Viet Cong were fighting with their bare hands, or a significant number of the people being counted as enemy kills were unarmed civilians. A confidential Army Inspector General investigation later estimated that civilian casualties during Operation Speedy Express may have numbered between 5,000 and 7,000. Investigative journalist Nick Turse described the operation as a My Lai a month. Huel's tactics relied on massive firepower nighttime artillery barrages, helicopter gunships, and airstrikes called into densely populated areas of the Delta, in a region where farmers, fishermen, and Viet Cong fighters lived side by side. The distinction between combatant and civilian was often ignored. Subordinate commanders felt intense pressure to produce high kill numbers. Those who didn't were criticized, sidelined, or relieved. The message from Huel's command was clear. Numbers mattered, how you got them didn't. Huel was never charged. He was never investigated in any way that led to consequences. He retired with 3 stars and wrote a book defending his methods. Thousands of people in the Mekong Delta, many of them civilians, died under a command structure that rewarded killing and punished restraint. Huel turned body count from a metric into an ideology. But the final general on this list, the worst of all 5, turned that ideology into the entire American strategy. And it cost 58,000 American lives and over 1 million Vietnamese. Number 1. William Westmoreland. General William Westmoreland commanded all American military forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, the years of maximum escalation, maximum combat, and maximum American casualties. He was the architect of the strategy that defined the war, and that strategy was fundamentally, irreversibly wrong. Westmoreland believed that the Vietnam War could be won through attrition. Kill enough enemy soldiers, destroy enough supplies, and eventually North Vietnam would reach a crossover point, the moment when casualties exceeded their ability to replace them. It was a theory that ignored everything about the war he was actually fighting. North Vietnam was not fighting a conventional war. It was fighting a revolutionary war, a war of political will, not military arithmetic. Ho Chi Minh and General Vong Yin Giap were willing to absorb casualties that would have broken any Western army. They had said so publicly. They had proved it at Dien Bien Phu against the French. And they would prove it again against the Americans. Westmoreland never adjusted. He launched massive search-and-destroy operations sweeping through jungle and villages with overwhelming firepower. Measuring success by the number of bodies left behind, the body count became the defining metric of the war. Officers were promoted for high counts, units were judged by their kill ratios, and the pressure to produce numbers led to inflated reports, misidentified civilians, and a system that rewarded destruction over progress. By January 1968, Westmoreland was telling Washington that the end was in sight. The enemy was weakening, the crossover point was near. Then came the Tet Offensive, on January 30, 1968. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks on over 100 cities and military installations across South Vietnam simultaneously. They struck the American embassy in Saigon. They seized the city of Hue. They attacked every major population center in the country. Militarily, Tet was a defeat for the North Vietnamese. They suffered enormous casualties and failed to hold any major objective. But strategically, Tet destroyed something far more important than any city. It destroyed the credibility of the American command. If the enemy was weakening, as Westmoreland had been saying for years, how could they launch the largest coordinated offensive of the entire war? In the aftermath, Westmoreland requested 206,000 additional troops. The request leaked to the press. The American public, already skeptical, concluded that the war was unwinnable. President Johnson denied most of the request and announced he would not seek re-election. Westmoreland was reassigned to Washington as Army Chief of Staff, a promotion in title, a removal in practice. William Westmoreland fought a war of attrition against an enemy that had already accepted the cost of attrition. He measured success in body counts in a war where bodies didn't matter. He told Washington the war was being won while the enemy was preparing its largest attack, and when reality finally broke through, he asked for 200,000 more soldiers to continue a strategy that had already failed. 58,220 Americans died in the Vietnam War. Over 1 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians perished. Westmoreland's strategy didn't cause all of those deaths, but it created the framework in which they happened, a framework built on the wrong assumptions, the wrong metrics, and the wrong understanding of the war he had been sent to win. That is why William Westmoreland is the worst general of the Vietnam War. 5 generals, 1 war, every level of command represented on this list. Harkins built the foundation of lies. Custer buried the truth when it mattered most. Lamb failed his country when it needed him. Ewell turned body count into ideology, and Westmoreland turned that ideology into a strategy that couldn't win. Not one of these men lacked resources. Not one of them lacked authority. Not one of them lacked the information they needed to make different choices at the moments that mattered. What they lacked was the willingness to confront the truth about the war, about the enemy, and about themselves. And the soldiers who served under them, American and Vietnamese, paid the price for it.